Здравствуйте, welcome back to Russian Through Propaganda. Today's episode 2 of our little series on how to read Russian poetry. If you missed episode 1, be sure and check it out. We covered a lot of ground in that video. We talked about Russian poetic meter and the different feet that can be used to build a line of traditional Russian poetry. So we covered a lot of stuff. By the way, if you like this stuff, hit subscribe and I'll keep making more of it. Anyway, today our topic is much more limited and quite a bit simpler than all the stuff on day one. We're talking about variations in certain words in terms of do they constitute a syllable, right? So certain words in Russian have two variants, one of which constitutes a syllable, the other of which doesn't. Right? Now, if we think back to what we learned about Russian meter, right, it's very much concerned with the number of syllables in a line of poetry, right? The number of syllables in a foot of poetry. And then, of course, we take a certain number of those feet to build our line of poetry, right? So the number of syllables is a very important thing. And as you can imagine, if a Russian poet is using one of these particles for which there is a syllabic and a non-syllabic variant, he or she is going to choose appropriately, right, in a way that will conform to the meter. Now, so this is pretty easy, really, and it's limited to a fairly small number of little particles. And so for students, it's really just a matter of spotting these things and knowing how to read them. So let's just go through the list here, starting with the hypothetical particle. That should be very familiar to anyone who's been through book 3 of the series. Right? We learn that as bui, right? And in normal Russian speech, of course, you would get that full version, the long version, the syllabic version, bui. How do we know that's syllabic, by the way? Well, because it has a vowel, right? And so in Russian, we almost always follow this principle. There's one syllable per vowel, right? Every vowel in a given word will constitute a syllable, right? So bui is one syllable and is indeed syllabic. Right? Now it has an asyllabic or non-syllabic variant, simply buh. And it's important to note that, strictly speaking, that asyllabic variant we can't pronounce it all by itself, right? Because in order to make a buh, we need some kind of a vowel to go with it, right? Either before or after, right? So when I sit here and say buh, I'm introducing an vowel that isn't actually present in the written form, which is simply a consonant b, right? So that already gives us a clue that we're going to have to get a vowel from somewhere, namely from the word that precedes this little asyllabic particle b, right? So here's a line. Again, hopefully some of these poems are familiar. They're very famous. Я б желал навеки так заснуть. Right, from Lermontov's "Выхожу один я на дорогу," right? Okay, so what are we really dealing with here? Я бы желал would be kind of the long form of that. Я бы желал, which is almost like я бы хотел, я хотел бы, right? I would like, hypothetically, right? I would like to fall asleep forever, such that, ... Right? Now, if Lermontov had used бы here, it would have violated the meter. Я бы желал навеки так заснуть, right? We're ending up with an extra syllable. The meter is totally ruined, and that's just it's not going to fly, right? So for that reason, he went with бы, right? Я бы желал. Okay, so the other question is, how do we read that, right? Now, it's always tempting to see the way it's written with, as a separate word, as a separate letter, and to therefore, pause between the words as we see printed on the page, right? And then we would probably say something like, Я бы желал навеки так заснуть, which again would introduce a vowel, an extra syllable, right? Бы is a syllable, right? So to read this correctly, we need to pretend that ya and be, those first two words, I guess, are a single word phonetically, and we say yab, yab. Я б желал навеки так заснуть. Я б желал навеки так заснуть, что в груди дремали жизни силы, and so on and so forth. Okay, so let's read it one more time really slowly. Я б желал навеки так заснуть. Я б желал навеки так заснуть. By the way, one advantage from our material in episode 1, right, is that once you're familiar with Russian meter and you kind of develop an ear for it, you'll be able to tell usually when there's some kind of violation, right? So if you were to read this, "Я бы желал навеки так заснуть," it would just ring immediately. You would notice that there's an extra syllable there once you have that kind of intuitive sense of the meter. Okay, so similarly, the interrogative particle, li, which as we know from our grammar it can mean whether to mark a reported yes or no question, or it can simply mark kind of a rhetorical question, right? It's an interrogative particle. It has an asyllabic variant, l, right? Soft L, and again, that's really actually unpronounceable, strictly speaking, without adding a vowel, right? So same principle as before. We need to read it as though it were a part of the word preceding it. So in this case, another poem from Lermontov, the same poem actually. Жду чего, жалею ли о чем? Жду чего, жалею ли о чем? Okay, so the first two words we really should think of as a single word, ждуль, ждуль, right? Again, we don't want to introduce a vowel, however kind of inconspicuous, and say something like ждуль чего, or I don't know what we might say, ждуль чего, жалею ли о чем, and that fits the meter perfectly. Next, we have the emphatic particle, je, right, which simply adds a bit of emphasis to whatever word comes before, and its asyllabic variant is simply je, right? Similarly, uja and uj, right, are words that are related to this, obviously, and you'll also see those variations there. But to stick with je, что же это? Он остановился. This is from Медный всадник, right, when Yevgeny is looking for Parasha's little hut, and he comes to the shore where it's supposed to be, and he realizes it's not there, and he's sort of bewildered, right? And he's like, what's going on? Что же это? Now, this is a good example of just the use of the emphatic particle, right? If this were just kind of a neutral question, we'd say, что это? Что это? But obviously, he's very upset, very perplexed, and so we throw in the je to give a little bit of extra emotion to the question. And here, again, in its asyllabic variant, что же это? Что же это? Он остановился. Okay, something a bit different, the reflexive particle, which of course we do write as part of the verb. It has, we know this very well from our grammar, right? Two versions, right? Sia and s, right? Just simply soft s. Now, of course, as we know now, the sia, we would say that's a syllabic little particle because, of course, it includes a vowel. It has its own vowel. Whereas the soft s all by itself has no vowel, so it doesn't constitute a syllable all by itself. Now, of course, we learn in just standard grammar that when we're using a form of a verb with the reflexive particle, we add sia when the form ends in a consonant, right? Like оделся, he got dressed, оделся. And we add the soft s when the verb form ends in a vowel, like оделась, right? She got dressed, right? Оделся versus оделась. So that's kind of the rule of thumb for modern Russian. But again, poets will use either form, right, in a way we wouldn't learn in our Russian class, depending on whether or not they need an extra syllable or maybe they need to lose a syllable, right? So again, they're always worried about the meter. Essentially, that means in this case that they can only add a syllable, right? So if we had a form that would normally be оделась, at least in modern Russian, оделась, they can recover an extra syllable by using the syllabic version of that, and they say оделася, right? Which we would never say in Russian class. This sounds very poetic, very sort of archaic, high style, literary Russian. В гранит оделась Нева. Right? Now, again, use your ear, right, after all your study of poetic meter, and read this with оделась, we would get в гранит оделась Neva. And hopefully you can hear that that's not, that violates the meter, right? В гранит оделась Neva. That's what we're looking for. В гранит оделась Neva. And so, of course, this is easy to read. We read just exactly what's on the page. It's not quite as tricky as our first three items, but it is kind of a deviation from the rules we teach in grammar. Okay, another example, and this is just one of several, but this is by far the most common. Sometimes poets will use an alternate ending for the feminine instrumental singular. And what this is actually is the Church Slavonic ending. So again, this would be associated more with sort of archaic, very bookish forms historically. This isn't a form that's an ending that's native to Russian itself, right? And so, for example, the instrumental that we'd learn in class for a feminine noun like zvezda would be zvezdoi, right? But the Church Slavonic variation of that would be zvezdoyu, zvezdoyu. And as you can see, by choosing between those two forms, a poet can gain an extra syllable, right? So here's the Lermontov poem, again, another excerpt from «Выхожу один я на дорогу». «И звезда с звездою говорит». «И звезда с звездою говорит». So, yeah, nothing really hard about that. We're reading what we see on the page, звездою. Now, it so happens that this line actually has another little interesting example in terms of phonetics and pronunciation. The s, right, that consonant, which itself is a preposition, of course, it doesn't have a vowel of its own either, right? So it's going to have to be pronounced as though it were one word with the word following it, right? And we practice that in our grammar even as early as book 1. Right, so in this case, the s is going to become voiced to assimilate to the following z, right? And so what we get here is kind of a double z, right? We don't hear s, we hear z. И звезда звездою говорит. So watch out for that rule as well whenever you're reading prepositions, right? That if the preposition is a single consonant, we can't introduce a vowel after that consonant. If we do, if we said something here like «И звезда со звездою говорит», we would be introducing an extra syllable by kind of sneakily inserting a vowel or a pause or whatever after that звездою is how we should read that. So we could give other examples of that here, but that's not really the point of this item 5, right? I'm really talking about the ending. But we should watch out for that general principle as well in terms of how we pronounce prepositions. Now watch out for the same ending, the same variation in certain pronoun forms in the instrumental, right? Instead of со мной, you can see со мною. Instead of с тобой, you can see с тобою. And instead of с ней, you can see с нею, right? And you see that in each of those cases, we're gaining an extra syllable. Okay, another item, this is something a little bit different. This is more of a question of variations in certain Russian nouns, also adjectives actually, and even, by the way, prepositions. So we could say a lot more about this, but for now let's just hit the highlights. And again, this also involves a syllable count. Right? Basically, for a lot of just old basic Slavic nouns like grad, grad corresponds to the modern Russian gorods, gorods, right? So gorod, again, is the modern Russian word for city. The older word, the older form of that is grad. And indeed, if you look at other Slavic languages, you're likely to see something more like the older form grad. Like in Czech, the word hrad with an H means castle in Czech. Originally, this noun really has more to do with a wall, right? So something walled. Since cities were originally walled, then this root, this word grad, and later in Russian gorod came to mean city. In Czech, it took a little slightly different root and came to mean castle, right, which is also walled, right? Okay, so anyway, so those are two just historical forms, right? Grad being older, more archaic, more kind of literary, more sort of biblical sounding, right? More high style, basically. So there are really quite a few words like this in Russian, and once you pick up on this pattern, uh, it can be easy to spot exactly what you're dealing with and even guess the meaning, right? So look at the second example. Let's stick with the word город from Pushkin's Медный всадник, right? The opening of this very famous sort of ode to Petersburg. Красуйся, град Петров, и стой. Красуйся, град Петров, и стой. Okay, so imagine what would happen, what a mess it would be if he had used город. Красуйся, город Петров, и стой. Right, the meter would be out the window, right? So in that case, he's gone with grad. Now, of course, it may help as well that this sounds a little bit more high style, right? This is kind of this hymn of praise to Petersburg. It's very high style. It's very lofty. And so the older form grad fits not only in terms of the meter, but also in terms of the stylistic register of the poem. Okay, let's take another Pushkin poem that's definitely markedly biblical in style, very high style. The prophet, prorok. И Бога глас ко мне воззвал, and the voice of God called out to me. Okay, so instead of и Бога голос ко мне воззвал, we have и Бога глас. Okay, so again, he's both saved a syllable in order to conform to the meter, and here, right, he's kept this word that, because it's archaic, this more archaic form, it's the form you would see in a Church Slavonic Bible, for example. And it also here marks the voice of God as being something distinct from an ordinary human golus, right? It has this very high, kind of lofty aura, almost sacred aura about it. And so it fits perfectly in terms of both the form and the stylistic register. Okay, let's look at one example with an adjective, right? From Lermontov's Angel, the angel. Он душу младую в объятиях нес. Right? Okay, can you guess the modern Russian for young? Молодой. Right? So here we have feminine accusative. Он душу молодую в объятиях нес. Okay, that would be way too many syllables. So instead of молодой, Lermontov is using молодой, младую. Он душу младую в объятиях нес. So you see the basic pattern, and there are other variations of this to watch out for. I'll give you a quick example that this is actually a preposition. In place of modern Russian перед, you may see пред, right? So there obviously the vowels are a bit different, but you see the general pattern. We have consonant or consonant in the modern Russian, right? We have two ors, whereas in the older form of the word, we have only one vowel, and that would typically be an ah, right? So in these words that in modern Russian you see or, you'll typically see ah in the older form, and that first vowel has dropped out. The technical term for this in modern Russian is polnoglassia, or pleophony. I'm not sure how people prefer to say that. Anyway, in Russian it's polnoglassia, which means something like full voicedness or full voweledness, right? In the sense that we filled in an extra vowel in the modern Russian. And that was a process, it was just simply a shift in pronunciation that happened in Russian fairly late in the game, right? After Russian had split off from other languages like Czech and Polish. And again, in those languages, this process didn't happen. Okay, one last thing to cover. Again, the question of how many syllables do we need? We learned in book 3 in the textbook series about how to form verbal nouns, right? How to make nouns from verbs, and we learned that those are all, well, almost all of them end up being special soft neuters, right? That is, they end in yeah. Now you may notice if you're reading that you may see variations that end instead of yeah, they end in soft sign yeah. Right? Now think about it. The ending yeah has two vowels, therefore two syllables. So by kind of condensing that and getting a soft sign in place of the e, we're saving a syllable. We have an ending now that has only one syllable. So a couple of examples from Pushkin. Я помню чудное мгновение. Right? Instead of я помню чудное мгновение. Right? That would be too many syllables. We want я помню чудное мгновение. Or some slightly more unusually, but this could also happen, a word that in modern Russian, like счастье, would indeed end in a soft sign yeah. By the way, this isn't a verbal noun. This is just a soft neuter noun, счастье. Here in Lermontov's poem, увы, он счастья не ищет. Right, so there he's actually kind of added a syllable, right? Where in modern Russian we would say счастье, he says счастья, счастья, right? 3 syllables. Увы, он счастья не ищет, right? And that's what he needs here to conform to the meter. Увы, он счастья не ищет. И не от счастья бежит, right? He doesn't seek happiness, meaning the sail, and by extension the man who's sailing in the sailboat. He's not seeking happiness, nor is he running from happiness, right? He's looking for storms. Okay, so that's a quick introduction, a quick survey of the most common variants of this sort, right? Where, again, you're going from asyllabic to syllabic based on the number of syllables you need. There's more we could say about this, right? We could look at some finer points, some additional examples and whatnot. Maybe I'll do that in a later video. But these are the big ones. So watch for these as you're reading, and be sure and pronounce them very carefully. And again, assuming you do, then the poetic meter should take care of itself. But remember, as we said in episode 1, you don't really need to know a lot about meter in order to read poetry correctly. But if you know about meter and have an ear for it, you'll be able to tell when you're misreading it, right? And this question of syllable count is one of the more obvious ways in which, if you violate the meter, right, by having too many syllables or too few, a well-trained ear is going to pick up on that immediately. So it can be a good way to kind of help police yourself as you're reading poetry. The more you read, the more you'll internalize these patterns, and you'll be able to know not only where should a stress fall, more than likely, but also how should I pronounce these syllabic versus asyllabic variations. Okay, that's all for today. So until next time, до свидания, товарищи.